Welcome, everybody, to the Canadian Philosophy Show. My name is Tagen Marshall, as if you didn't already know, and I'm here with two esteemed co-hosts, Michael Robert Caditz and Hale Rothery. I'll let them greet you, starting with Mikey. How you doing?
I am okay. I'm really looking forward to this show, Tagen, and hopefully I can find some objections and skepticism because that's one of my roles here. So I'm looking forward to that.
Cheers. Over to Hale Rothery, everybody.
Thanks, Tagen. I'm also really happy to be here. Looking forward to today's show. It's good to be on a show that you're leading and you've picked the topic on. It's been a little while since I've got to be a part of that, so I'm looking forward to it, and I'm sure we're gonna have a really good discussion.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it as well, having these two intellectual giants to debate and have a convo with. So with that in mind, you might be saying, Tagan, what are we talking about tonight? Fair question. Tonight I am talking about an issue, a subject, a conversation which is near and dear to my heart, and that is one of empowerment. That is one of overcoming unreasonable expectations or irrational expectations. The thesis I will be putting forward tonight and the discussion I hope to have is as follows. It is my belief and understanding that the discipline of philosophy itself is always ordered towards the empowerment and the empathetic. This will lead us into a discussion of sympathy versus empathy and how it is my belief that philosophy strives to take the empathic route and the route towards empowerment of its readers and those that practice and live with philosophy to make the best choices in their lives to empower themselves and others. This will lead into a conversation, I'm sure, of how this relates to society, of which I will share my experience as a person with a physical and intellectual disabilities. But first, for an introduction on why I believe that philosophy by its very nature takes the empathetic route. So, let me begin. Tagen, what is philosophy? That's a good question. Because in knowing what philosophy is, we can then better understand what its mission and purpose is. So philosophy is the combination of two Greek words, philos and Sophia or Sophie, which means the love of wisdom. A more accurate translation I've heard from my professors and I ascribe to is not just the love of wisdom, but the active pursuit of wisdom itself. It's one thing to love something and to feel a strong reverence for something, but it's another thing to pursue it. It's another thing to want to apply it to our day-to-day life. And I think especially with wisdom, what is wisdom but understanding, comprehension, and I would say empowerment? Because in the pursuit of truth, which philosophy strives towards, an understanding of what truth itself is, a discernment of what truth is. This is a journey which we are all on, as philosophy students to understand, whether it's Descartes, Spinoza, Thomas Aquinas, Augustine, whoever the heck it is. And whether it's one of those late greats or more modern scholarship, we want to understand the message that they put forward. It is in the pursuit of wisdom and understanding that we not only come to care for people, but it enriches our lives because we can better understand the conditions which our friends, family, and neighbors are involved in. Philosophy really isn't one to play the sympathy card, because that's not wisdom. What is sympathy but to feel, to feel sadness for someone, to feel their pain, versus empathy is to understand intellectually and with the heart, I would argue, because I'm not about to argue that emotions and reasons and rationality truly conflict. Although, as Plato and Socrates would stress, that reason needs to be the top of our of the soul complex, right? The three parts of the soul analogy: desire, spirit, and reason, rationality. And so I hope that in this conversation that we have tonight, as we talk about different things, as we debate the truth of this claim, that we would come to a better understanding of not only the position, but a better understanding of why, my co-hosts may take objection or may support this claim, but also that this can this can begin a discourse which I don't think has happened. Does society choose empathy, which I argue leads to the ability for that person who's experiencing whatever it is to choose support? Or does sympathy actually only prolong the maybe emotional suffering of that person, or make it harder for them to actually see who they are and what their identity is? So, yeah, I hope that makes sense, and I am looking forward to jumping into it. I just want to see if there's any thoughts from my co-host before we continue.
Tagen, could you repeat your claim very concisely and clearly?
Yes, sorry. My claim is that philosophy always takes the side of empathy.
Okay, so my next question would be, could you elaborate and clarify the bridge that you're apparently drawing between an understanding of the arguments that are made by philosophers? You gave Aquinas and Spinoza and Descartes as examples. How would one's understanding of the theories of those philosophers relate to, or transfer to, or
Right.
bridge over to empathy for other people, in terms of relationships or friendships or social
Right.
interactions?
Right. So for Descartes, right? He is a rationalist, and so he posits that the senses can be and often are deceptive. So he argues that knowledge can be understood and and come into being through the mind, strictly through rationality. And I would argue that emotions are part of the more sensory experience of the human condition. that they are usually prompted by some physical either bodily reaction or something to that nature. And so you look at someone like Descartes or Spinoza, right? Those are two radically opposed, but what they strive to do in their work is to allow an individual to think through some of their preconceived notions, to question their beliefs and their ideas, to come to a fuller understanding of truth. The Platonics would argue for rationality above everything else, and that when your house is well ordered, that in the pursuit of the good, right, in empathizing with each other, in sharing this with each other, you are moving society forward towards the ultimate end, towards a better space. And as for Aquinas, right? The ultimate good for Aquinas was to live life with God, and ultimately what that looks like. So in all of these guys, you see a desire to stop the preconceived notions of their day and come to an understanding of fundamental importance. And I think when it comes to empathy, right, these are philosophers who I think at the very least would by their very writing would say no. It's not good to remain stagnant. It's not good to remain where you are. You must push forward and pursue whatever it is, whether it's God or the good of society, whatever, to better yourself. And by bettering yourself, you're allowing yourself to be a better friend, a better, you know, relationship partner to other people, because you are pursuing something greater than yourself.
So, Tagen, are you suggesting that philosophical mind, a person who's educated in philosophy and has been trained, whose mind has been trained as a philosopher, is better equipped to relate to other people and is better equipped to exhibit empathy, show empathy for other people in his or her personal life?
Well, I mean, Sartre is the obvious exception, because Jean-Paul Sartre famously said, "What is hell?" but other people. So obviously Sartre had a thing or two against that. But I would say by virtue of our training and the ability to sit back and question our own beliefs and desire to know the truth, desire to know what is true, we are then able to better apply that within our relationships, to say, I understand that you are feeling this way, but let's journey together to try and help each other understand what the root of this is, right? And I think that's what I'm trying to say.
So, to make sure I understand, are you saying that someone with a philosophical mind who's trained him or herself to analyze
Right.
Situations in a rational way
Mm-hmm.
rather than purely emotional? So
Right.
that Spinoza would call that an adequate understanding of events, adequate as opposed to
Right.
inadequate. So one that's based on rationality, or at least I think Spinoza would argue a balance between emotion and rationality. I think
Right.
Spinoza would argue that unchecked emotions over which one has no control are very detrimental, whereas adequate emotions, which are a person has some control over because of a balance between emotion and rationality, that
Mm-hmm.
person would be better equipped to be a better person altogether and relate to other people. So is that what you're saying? Are you taking sort of a position like Spinoza would take, a Spinozistic
Yeah,
position?
I'm taking. Well, let me re-explain my bigger reason for choosing this topic, because when you understand the big picture, it may be easier to understand where I'm coming from right now. I would say you're correct, Mikey. Um, what I want to do in this show is do exactly what philosophers have done for centuries. Looking at my own experience, maybe talking about some of the social movements that are happening, and say which is a better approach. Is it sympathy or is it empathy? And I'll tell you right now, spoiler alert, um, brace yourselves. From my personal experience as a person with a disability, I will always be arguing empathy versus sympathy, because empathy brings the individual to a deeper understanding of not only me, but not only themselves, but also me. Versus sympathy seems to allow for there to be a lot of preconceived ideas and preconceived notions, which when gone unchecked, leads to some actually difficult difficult moments for me. And so, yeah, I would say that, like I said before, I would say that emotions are wonderful things when in balance with reason. You can't. In fact, I would go as far to say you can't have one without the other. You can't relate to people without emotions, but you can't relate to them effectively without having that in check and in unison with rationality.
So you're correlating sympathy with more with emotion and empathy more with rationality. Is that
Exactly.
correct?
That's
Okay.
exactly correct.
So now I'm starting to understand what your claim is. Your claim is that since philosophy is in large part based on rationality, it leads to empathy in
Mhm.
interpersonal relationships, whereas someone who didn't have rational capabilities or hasn't developed their capabilities for rational thinking would be more likely to respond emotionally and sympathetically to someone else. Is that right?
Let
Correct.
me,
Okay.
if you don't mind, I've just been thinking about what you've been saying, Tagen, and digesting it, and I think what comes up for me is like I hear your division between sympathy and empathy, and for our listeners who don't know, I work in the mental health field, and this is a very common division that people make, and I think on some level at least I get where you're coming from. The thing about sympathy is that sympathy, as an intentional state, something that, let's, as you're saying, I just feel it makes some requirements on me, right? Like if I see someone who is hurt, let's say, and I feel sympathy for that person, I just feel bad for them. And oftentimes we might vocalize that, but we might not. But there's no imperative there. Um,
Mhm.
the difference with empathy, I think, when people are experiencing genuine empathy, at least, is that people relate in such a way where they know the consequences um, of what someone else is going through, and that situation, that context, implores on them to be active about it, to do something. So in that sense, I think that empathy has an element to it which it's an implicit activity. And I think it, at least for part of what I'm hearing, is that there's a connection there with philosophy too, and that they kind of line up because philosophy is also an activity. And if one is to really
Mhm.
seek the truth and go out there and be be a part of that process, then the truth makes imperatives on you. You can't just sort of willy-nilly make decisions and decide to think whatever you want. You come to know and realize things, and that's going to have an impact on how you treat other people in particular. So in that way, the two of them sort of line up as both making requirements, particularly on how we live with others.
Right.
I think that since, Tagen, your premises involve a distinction between empathy and sympathy, I think it would be worthwhile for us to be more clear and elaborate more on the distinction, because I can imagine some of our listeners not being sure what those terms mean and how they're different. Although you've said that sympathy is more correlated with emotion, whereas empathy may be more correlated with rationality, or perhaps more of a balance of rationality and emotion. But I was wondering if we could come up with some, and I'd volunteer to come up with some specific examples to make it more clear for our listeners, like what would be a case of sympathy versus a case of empathy.
Well, I think Tagen, I have a suspicion that you have a particular example in mind for how those have played out in a very real way.
Right. The best experience is always to speak from your own experience, because that's the only experience you can truly know. Controversial opinion. We'll talk to Descartes about that. But anyway, so I appreciate that. My example would be, right, I have had people, well-meaning, beautiful people in my life, who either I know or I don't know, more often than I don't know, come and sit and chat sympathetically. So, meaning that they want to console me in some way. They want to say, hey, I understand. Hey, I get it. Hey, can I do this for you? But that does not allow me to, right? That does not allow them to see my process of my thought process. That does not allow them to really understand who I am, because there's this automatic assumption that, okay, well, he's obviously physically disabled. Guess what? For those who are listening on the radio, I am. So hi there. I see this all too often, that if a chair is involved, there's this idea that exists within those people. I would say it's more of a just lack of awareness thing, where they assume, well, and it's all unconscious, I think, but where they assume, well, he obviously needs me to slow down my speech. So a lot of the time, I will get this when I roll up to somewhere. Oh, hello there. How are you today? Doing well? That's great. And I say nothing because I'm like, but in reality, if it's someone I know, someone I'm close to, right, it'll be like, yo, what's up? And I'll be like, I'm good, thanks, how are you? Right. A key example which I will share is the story of a man I met in chapters. We'll call him Jerry. Jerry is my fake name for everyone. And so Jerry walks in, and I'm drinking my smoked butterscotch latte. It was a good time. Prior pandemic times. And he came and he sat down. Well, he asked me if he could use my table, and I'm like, yeah, of course, for sure. And he sits down, I see he's walking with a cane, and so I ask him what the cane is for, and he tells me about his epic life journeys. And so we're talking and stuff, and I mentioned, hey, I love writing as well, and so we're talking, everything's going great. And then he says, well, you must have a lot of free time. That's not the case. And I didn't even realize this assumption. It was one of my other friends who realized it. And they jumped in and defended me, said, well, actually, he doesn't. And the man was like, oh, Jerry was like, oh. And he's like, what do you do? And I say, well, I'm a full-time philosophy major at Vancouver Island University. His eyes went wide and he kind of got all nervous and uncomfortable. But see, the point I'm trying to draw with this is that the sympathy approach, the approach which I argue makes so many more assumptions than the empathetic approach, because in order to have sympathy, you try to relate to that person's pain. You try to understand so that you don't offend. And right, it's kind of like it's kind of like the fear that I sometimes have when someone I love is grieving or someone I know is grieving, and the last thing I want to say, because they hear it all the time, is I'm sorry for your loss. Right.
Okay, so yeah.
And so I would say that the sympathy approach, at least in my example, can be more harmful because it doesn't do justice to the person that is experiencing it.
Okay, Tagen, it sounds to me like you're saying that sympathy involves more the experience of the how would you say, like the witness, rather than the person who's experiencing the pain or the issue.
Right.
So if I come to you and I notice you're disabled, then I have my own experience. I feel bad for you. I don't want to offend you. I
Correct.
have all these assumptions about you. And so I start to behave from my own experience rather than actually inquiring or asking or paying attention to what's really going on for you. So is that right? So sympathy, you gave some detailed examples of sympathy, seem to involve assumptions and the emotional experience of the witness, right, of the person you're interacting with.
Right.
So now, okay, so if that's right, then now I'm curious about an example of empathy. Could you give an example of empathy specifically?
Absolutely. So empathy, on the other hand, is someone who, here, I can give you an example. Maybe not the strongest example, but an example nonetheless. I'm in an English class, public speaking class, and one of my colleagues, um, after I'd given a speech, came right up to me and was like, "Yo, really loved it. Was really impressed. Thank you so much." And I was like, "Thank you." Um, or another example from my life is someone came up to me the other day and said, I'm sorry, I wanted to come up to you sooner and talk to you and thank you for your speech you gave the other day, but I was too nervous to come up and do that. And that gave me an opportunity right then, because there was an opening for communication. There was an open heart to understand, and I was able to say, yeah, I appreciate that, because there's so few that would feel comfortable and at ease even if they're a little nervous to come up and admit that, because that's hard. And so I was able to say, yeah, no worries, absolutely not a problem. Understand, um, and thank you for making that known, because I have a lot more respect for. Well, I have respect for people regardless, but I have a special sense of appreciation for people if they do feel kind of nervous or whatever, who come up to me anyway, and just express that, because that's a great way to build a relationship.
So I think I'm making some progress, Tagen, and tying together philosophy with
Yeah,
sympathy and empathy as you're describing. I'm making some progress.
yeah, no, and I apologize that it's kind of a bigger way. It's not a linear line. It's more just a spider's web, right in time for Halloween. So there you go.
Yeah, but let me see if I'm getting it, and maybe help the readers, and then see if Hale sees it this way also. But okay, so if I'm sitting in a philosophy class,
Yep.
uh, and the professor says, as this has actually happened to me, now we're going to learn about Thomas Aquinas and his theory of natural law. I immediately have this emotional reaction based on my preconceived notions of Aquinas and natural law, right? I start thinking, oh, great, here's going to be this like really like ultra, conservative religious guy with all this dogma that, thinks, thinks that sex outside of marriage is wrong, and the only legitimate purpose for sex is procreation, and you're not supposed to enjoy it, and so I'm going to have all these preconceived notions about Aquinas. So that's sort of a sympathetic reaction in a way, right? Because I'm not really finding out. I'm closed-minded about what Aquinas really has to say. I'm operating on my own emotions, and like, oh, I really feel bad about having to learn about Aquinas. Now, let's say that as I did, that I decide to be open-minded because it's a class, and I want to learn more. I want to be a philosopher here, so I really want to understand what Aquinas was saying, even though I have an initial emotional reaction. Perhaps there's something of value in learning about Aquinas. Even if I never agree with anything Aquinas says, at least I can start to understand his theory and where he's coming from. And indeed,
Right.
that's what happened to me when I had a professor there at VIU who actually was quite identified with Aquinas in many ways. And so that professor was able to really eloquently explicate and explain where Aquinas was coming from. Now, I never ended up identifying more with Aquinas, but I really did get an appreciation for Aquinas's logic and where he was coming from, and I did very well in that class. So I'm thinking that was empathy. That
Right.
was empathy. And so if I
Right.
go to you, Tagen, and apply that principle that I learned in my medieval philosophy class, I could say so. Now, here's what I'm getting at, Tagen. I want you to tell me if I approached you in this way, would you think this is empathy? So if I said to you, Tagen, wow, I noticed you're uh, you seem to be disabled. What's that like
Yeah.
for you? What's that like for you? How do you feel about it, and how does that affect your life? And do you have to talk slower or not, or do you need me to talk slower or not? And
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
how would you like me to relate to you that would work for you? Is that more empathic?
Yeah, I would definitely say that's more empathic. The most empathic way is just come up to me like you would come up to any normal person and start a dialogue. Um, the, at least for me, there's no special way you need to start a dialogue. I'm not going to be like, bow down to me, able bodied peasant. But yeah, that would definitely be more sympathetic. And just before we continue, I want to welcome our listeners who are just tuning in to the Canadian Philosophy Show. I'm your main host today, Tegan Marshall, and we're talking about sympathy versus empathy, or what I would call the sympathy versus empathy dilemma and distinction. So yeah, so back to your point, Mikey, about would you coming up to me and saying, "Hey, I notice you have a physical disability. Is there a particular thing you need me to do?" I would probably then just kind of laugh and say, "No, you're good. Don't worry about it." So yeah, but that's definitely more empathetic, because that empowers me to enter into your world, to use the existentialist concept, and to work with you to come to a better understanding of where you're coming from, so that you can be more receptive to me as an individual, versus running off of preconceived consumption. Not
Right.
consumptions,
Yeah.
yeah, because we're eating lunch. Assumptions.
So I just want to.
But just to
Oh no, go ahead. So I just want
no,
to.
but you,
As I've been thinking about this, I think I'm also kind of getting the distinction, and I want to run a couple things by you, Tagen, and for the listeners as well. One thing I think you pointed out a few times, and I'll touch on this a second, is the notion of empathy and understanding, and obviously philosophy. Understanding is a core component of that activity. But to take a step back and talk about sympathy again for a moment, the thing about sympathy that I think that I find as a sort of mental stance is that it's selfish. And I don't, but to our listeners, I don't want to mean that you were like a bad person, or anyone's a bad person by not making a moral judgment necessarily there. And anytime anyone is sympathetic, I think it comes up for many of us. I know for myself too, quite frequently. But the reason I say that is that when I'm sympathetic, it's about me, right? So for instance, if I see someone who's hurt, I feel sympathetic for them. I feel bad. And because I feel bad, I feel uncomfortable. And then often the way sympathy shows itself, and the ways you kind of use so eloquently in your examples, is that people feel uncomfortable. So they try and mitigate the situation in ways that don't actually take the other person in the relationship into account as they are, right? They're coming from a place of their own uncomfortability, of their own painful feelings, right? Like myself feeling bad for the said person. I want to get rid of that. So I go up to them and say what I'm going to say, or I perhaps avoid them. I think a lot of times when people are in a stance of sympathy, like we were talking about earlier, that what they do is they actually avoid the person or the situation because they don't really understand what they're going through. Instead, we're wrapped up on our own negative emotions.
And
oh no, sorry. Go ahead, Taken.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say. So, and you mentioned something there though with understanding and getting into someone's world. With empathy, I think the point is that on some level, as I'm hearing it from you and from as I understand as well, one is able to make an equivalency with oneself and the other. And what I mean by that is I'm able to have some sort of genuine understanding of where someone else is at or what they're going through. This can seem kind of strange, but I think we need to take a step back and think about both our cognitive and emotional states, and how there's a lot of different relationships, even in regards to lots of external or what might seem like very contextually different situations. Let me use a very quick example. Say someone, I'm not going to speak as this being your experience, Tagen, but I'm just going to use this as an example. Say someone is in a wheelchair and they experience life as a life that often feels trapped in one way or another.
Yep.
Someone may also feel trapped from a very different place, though. Let's say that they suffer from severe chronic depression or something like that. That also doesn't allow them to do many things, to engage in many different activities or lifestyles, and they may also feel incredibly trapped. There's a way in which I think that the depressed person in the scenario and the person in the wheelchair may actually be able to meet in a kind of equivalency in their being and their existential situation, as you might say, Tagen, that sort of transcends just the individual and allows them to really interact with each other on a kind of a higher level, to really see the person.
No.
However, I will say from my own experience of doing this that this does present a problem, and a roadblock sometimes, and that is, it depends a lot on people's personal experience, and it depends a lot on how imaginative someone is. Empathy is not, as is someone, as I know from kind of working in the field, empathy is not something that all people have on tap. To say it the way, a lot of people really struggle to make that kind of connection, to make that sort of relation.
Right.
And that might become because they're not
Yeah.
practiced at it, but that might also be because people do not have the requisite experiences or perhaps imagination to make that possible.
Yeah. I was just gonna say, right, in a sense, empathy comes out of a little bit your social conditioning, and so if you would know better than I, Hale, but my assumption, despite the fact that I'm against assumptions, would be, if you grow up kind of isolated and you don't have much experience interacting with a lot of different groups of people, which I think is sometimes what happens with me and able-bodied individuals, right? Because for them, having a high-functioning, physically disabled person, in their world, whether that's in education or in their community, can be odd for them. And so they just, they don't have the prior experience to know how to accurately respond. And Hale, I want to get your response on this, but there's a few things I want to say just briefly, if I could, so I don't forget them, and then we can come back to them. Is, first of all, I want to say to our listeners that I am not the pinnacle of empathy. In fact, I can be. There are far more situations where I probably could be more empathetic. But that's why I say I'm only speaking from my own experience. Actually, it angers me when I see people with disabilities on TV, kind of acting like they're all that in a bag of chips, acting as if their disability somehow makes them superior, because I don't think that's right. That's not how, or at least that's not how I see the world, right? That the disability should not be, I am Tagen Marshall the disabled. That should not be it, but it should be, yeah, I'm Tagen, and yeah, I happen to be disabled. That's a part of my world, but not my defining factor. What I would also like to say really quickly is that as a person with disability, you know who has the strongest sense of empathy, partially because they have no filter? Children. Children are just very straight up. I've been walking down, rolling down, because I know somebody might say, he said walking, what happened? Some sort of miraculous thing? No, it's just the turn of phrase, because even I'm not gonna say rolling down the street. So I was walking down the street, and this girl and her family and this child turned around, looked at me, and said, "What happened to you?" And that's a little jarring at first, because you're like, well, it's none of your business. But then you're like, oh wait, this is the kid. So then, right, you tailor your response. But one of the most touching moments that I've seen, this kind of contrast of sympathy versus empathy, is I was at a beach one time, just rolling down and whatever, and this little girl was with her dad, I presume. And children are often very shy as well, so they will see me, and they'll ask their dad, like, what happened to his legs? Why is he, why is he in a chair like that? And the parent will be like, shh. but then I'll be like, No, it's all good. And so I turned around. I was, for those who don't know, my chair stands up. So I was standing at the time. So I turned around, and I said, "Hey, you got a question for me?" And she was like, "So why don't your legs work?" And so, depending on who that is, obviously, I'm gonna give a bit of a different response. But usually, I'll say something to the effect of, "Well, I was born a little too early, and so my legs don't work." And they're like, "Oh," you know, um, and I think we see, right, the desire of a sympathy is, oh, let's not make it worse than it already is, right? Versus empathy tries to take the approach of, they're human, they have a right to be treated the same way, um, as I would. And so, yeah, I think that's just a cool example. But Hale, I don't know if you had more or not.
I know. I think Mikey had something you wanted to say. So why don't we let him jump in? Then I might have a little bit more here.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I'll try and give you some empathy here, Tagen. So I'm hearing that you have various experiences with people you encounter, and some of those people respond to you in a way that you're characterizing as sympathetic, and other people respond to you in a way that you're characterizing as empathetic. And you associate sympathy with assumptions, and perhaps incorrect assumptions about your limitations and capacities, because you think of yourself as being quite more able than many people who are giving you what you would call sympathy assume you to be. And you're associating empathy with people who just treat you like a normal person. So
Right.
is that right? I'm trying to be
Yeah.
empathetic to you right now and
Yeah.
understand understand
Yeah.
where you're
And
coming from. Yeah.
and I think I would also say I'm making another assertion, which is not necessarily a common assertion, but something we talked about in one of my in a class I took for VIU Discovery Days. Go Vancouver Island University, go Mariners, let's go. But was I was in a social work, introductory social work class they had for Discovery Days, and the professor talked about how when you're a community support worker primarily, right? You want to be able to provide members of that community with empathy, so that they feel empowered to work as a community, to better themselves, and right, similar to what I was saying with the Platonics, right? To pursue a common goal, to not only better themselves as individuals but as a group. And so I'm also saying that sympathy actually takes away my ability, to empower not only myself but share with others, versus empathy allows me to enter into an individual's world, to use Heidegger's language, so that not only do I have the ability to witness to the truth of my life and the goals of my life, but also to empower that person to maybe go in with a different set of expectations the next time.
So I want to make a little, taken as I'm listening to you, I want to make a little assertion here myself for our listeners in relationship to empathy, particularly in relationship to philosophy. And I think empathy is particularly pertinent in moral philosophy. And here's why. At the beginning, you
Mm.
mentioned the meaning of philosophy. You mentioned philo, roughly meaning lover, Sophia, meaning wisdom, or oftentimes is understood as the pursuit of wisdom. Obviously, wisdom is always concerned with some particular body of knowledge. Philosophy often labels itself as the highest order of knowledge, um, with first principles and such. However, there are obviously subsets within philosophy. One of those is moral theory or ethics,
Mm.
and I want to say that empathy plays an essential role in ethics. And the reason is because ethics is primarily concerned with how we deal and interact with others in the right way. But, and I'm taking a little bit from Aristotle here, for us to have a conception of our study, to have an understanding of what we're studying, we have to understand the entities being studied or that are concerned within that particular body of knowledge. In the sense of ethics, it's going to be other people primarily. We could also say it would, could be other beings, whether they be, for example, the earth or, animals or whatever it might be. But let's just keep with people for now and say that, well, if we need to properly understand, to genuinely understand other people, to be able to articulate a capable ethical theory, then we're going to need empathy, because it's empathy that allows us to genuinely understand other persons that are going to come up in any particular ethical context. This is why I'll say that for those of you, our listeners, who have some experience with ethical theories, there are ethical theories that feel, one might say, remarkably dry. One might say alien. And the reason they do is because I'd posit, at least in part, because they do not have a proper grasp of the complexity or the individuality of the subjects at hand. So that's why I think when you bring up empathy, that's the main thing that I think when I connect it with philosophy, is that at least for a certain branch of philosophy, it is essential.
Yep.
Hale, when you started speaking, you said that sympathy is needed for ethics, and then you finished saying that empathy is needed for ethics.
If I made the mistake there, I definitely mean empathy for that.
Okay, not sympathy.
Empathy.
But
Oh yeah, definitely empathy.
Yeah. I since it's getting sort of near the end of the show, I want to express where I've landed, more or less, on this, because this is one of those rare occasions when I went into the show and with presented with your thesis, Tagen, without having my own conclusion, without knowing where I landed on it, and now I have a better sense, and so I'm going to say that I support your thesis up to a point, and I support your thesis, Tagen, up to the point that we define sympathy as one, involving assumptions, and two, generally involving my experience. If I'm doing the sympathizing, it's really more my experience, and that's something that you pointed out very eloquently, Hale. It's my pain I'm feeling, assuming it's your pain. I'm making assumptions about you, Tagen, if I'm using you as an example here, and then I'm going through my emotional experience because of all the assumptions I'm making about you, which may or may not be true. And you're saying that in your life they're often false. So whereas empathy would be a quest for knowledge, being inquisitive, finding out what really, Tagen, is your experience and what's your reality, not my assumptions. Now, I agree with you that goes hand in hand with philosophy, because for this reason, we all learned about Socratic dialogue. We all learned about Plato and how Plato taught us, and even contemporary philosophers like Bertrand Russell have taught us that that the most effective way to make an argument with somebody, or opposing argument, if you're debating somebody, is to fully understand that person's argument first. I need to argue against your best argument for my argument to be effective and strong. So that's the philosophical way, is to understand Aquinas, understand Descartes. Whether or not I'm going to land on Aquinas' side is irrelevant. First, I need to fully understand Aquinas' strongest arguments. I need to understand Descartes' strongest arguments. It so happens I really don't identify with Descartes' dualism, right, with Cartesian dualism, but I believe that I have a pretty good understanding of where Descartes was coming from. And that's why empathy goes along with philosophy. And I'm going to support you on this thesis, Tagen, because if I encounter you, just like if I encountered Aquinas, not that I'm equating you with Aquinas, or if I encountered Descartes, I want to understand what you're really about, not my assumptions, not my emotional reaction, not my feelings. I want to know about you, empathic learning about you, getting out of myself and learning about you. I support you with that completely. Philosophy lends itself. The Socratic dialogue, arguing against the best argument of the other person, goes hand in hand with understanding the other person, whether that be a philosopher or whether that be a common person, a philosophy student that has some disabilities. However, where I'm not so sure I have a buy-in here, Tagen, is the following. It's I hear you injecting some of your own personal experience. Like in your particular case, you
Right.
are amazingly abled. Despite your disabilities, you've overcome them. You can speak to somebody as a normal person. You can still get around, albeit with some assistance. You've worked out an amazingly normal life despite your disabilities. And but that might not be the case with all people. One can imagine there are people who are severely disabled and can't get out of a bed. They can't move around,
Right.
and they do have to speak very slowly, or in order to understand someone else, that other person has to
Correct.
speak very slowly. So in that case, my empathy, in other words, learning about that person, might wind up giving me the conclusion that I do have to speak slowly, that I do have to, uh, you know, be very
Yeah.
gentle with that person. So in your particular
Yeah.
case, you're lucky, Tagen. I don't have to do those things. So in your case, if someone makes those assumptions, they're not being empathic. But I just wanted to,
Yeah.
remind
And
listeners that there are people out there who do need to be treated in a more gentle or different
right.
way. Or yeah.
And as we're closing out the show, what I would say is, if I was to leave you with one thing, I would leave you with this: is that it's always better to expect more than to expect less. So if that means you attempt in your regular everyday way to communicate or whatever with someone, and actually they do need those adjustments, that's fine. But it is always better, in my opinion, to assume the best, because when we assume the worst, we may very well be discrediting that person and their abilities. So I would say it's good to be compassionate. It's good to be cognizantly aware of what you may perceive going on in that person's life. But it is still always better to expect more and have to walk it back a little bit than expect less and be proven wrong.
Okay, I accept that. I accept that until I learn otherwise, I will treat you or anyone I encounter uh, like a normal person and not treat the person according to my preconceived notions based on how the person looks or the label or what the person, what someone told me about the person. I accept that. But my point was that empathy might involve finding out
Yep.
that I need to treat
Yeah,
someone
exactly.
in a
Yep.
different way, because
Yep.
as empathy, as I believe we're agreeing, it is here, is simply finding out and learning and trying to understand another person's reality, getting out of myself and really understanding you wherever that path leads me.
Yep. I think we agree. Hale, is there any last words from you?
I think you guys summed it up pretty well. Sometimes when I think about empathy, I think about it more um, like a mirror, right? And this leads to, like I kind of hinted earlier, and I think what you guys were already talking about a little bit too, is that there are limits. I think at the end of the day, we cannot jump outside of ourselves, but we can use our own positions as a
Mm.
way to sort of reflect and genuinely understand where someone else is at or is coming from, or what their particular context or situation is. However, that does have its limitations, right? There are limitations
Mm.
on how much each of us can do that, depending upon who we're dealing with, and also and there's a wide variety within that too, whether or not they come from perhaps whether they have a physical or cognitive difference, or they come from a different um, background or culture, or even there are even perhaps some extreme points of view, it's difficult to be empathetic with. But I think it's
Right.
something that can be practiced, and I do think that it's something that
Right.
that is essential to a serious go at moral philosophy.
Mhm. And with that, this has been the Canadian Philosophy Show. I'm your host for tonight, Tagen Marshall, here with Michael Robert Caditz and Hale Rothery, leaving you with one of my favorite quotes from Dead Poets Society. Only in their dreams can men be truly free. It was always thus, and always thus will be. Good day, everyone.